So I just want to thank everybody for coming, for those who are just here to provide support, and to the wonderful readers for this lengthy, complex thesis that Rae has written. So thank you to Key Slaughter, to Natalia, Alvaro Figueroa, sorry, and William Matney. And over to you, Rae.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and then do the PowerPoint thing. So you're going to see a little bit of the beginnings of it. Okay. And then I'm going to try to. Oh, all right, sweet. So I'm going to put a timer on just for myself because I've run through this multiple times. It's been quite a challenge to try to do just the broad strokes across this whole thing in one PowerPoint. I feel like I could literally do a PowerPoint for each chapter. So this is going to be a lot of broad like summary as much as possible. And then I'm hoping that some of the nuances that I sadly feel weird about glazing over, some of the nuances we can hopefully get into just in conversation. So just putting that out there. All right. First off, I just want to thank everyone for all the comments and feedback that I've already gotten. I'm really grateful for everybody's work and labor that they've put into this so far. Here we go. Let's get to it. So my agenda for, I say that tongue in cheek. I'm going to go through my definition, a quick thing about definitions and impositionality. We'll talk about what motivated my thesis, why I chose post-intentional phenomenology, what some of my current findings have been generated through this process, how I feel like it connects to research and clinical practice, and where I feel like we could go from here. So for folks watching the recording who don't know what some of these words are, you could pause, read this if you want to. The Translanguage Primer has a really great collection of terms. So I am a white, queer, transmasculine, non-binary, pangender, more specifically enabled person who grew up immersed in the white, working class, rural, Southern culture of so-called Texas. I understand myself to be assumed human enough at birth because of my whiteness and my assumed endosex embodiment, my ability and my neurodevelopmental trajectory. I have spent most of my adult years unlearning and shifting habits of internalized white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, misogyny, sizeism, ableism, and saneism, among others. This process has emerged through relationships with people who hold me both in care and accountability, and I'm forever grateful to all the folks in my life who continue to nurture me, and I continue to nurture them. I currently reside at the moment on forcibly occupied lands colonially labeled as Connecticut and traditionally stewarded by the Wampanoag, Pawcatuck, and Chattahoochee peoples. Ooh. So my motivations, I've throughout, honestly, since my undergrad and forward, I felt a lot of complex feelings about the pervasive and persistent cisnormative assumptions I witness emerging from care work literature and professional standards. If cisnormativity is ever discussed or acknowledged, it's typically referred to as transphobia or conflated with homophobia or heteronormativity. And often I find it's held in separation from other bioessential systems of oppression. A lot of my experiences with relational dynamics in care work and with professional and educational relationships in general, I've been struggling to name. And I find that that's in connection to how most literature, if they discuss trans, two-spirit, intersex, or otherwise non-conforming people, they discuss us as clients only and typically situate us as vulnerable or frame us as incapable of being a clinician. So I have continued to feel feelings that I've called systemic gaslighting, but others may call epistemic erasure, epistemic injustice, that I've really struggled to describe, especially while attending to my experiences as an enabled white person, because these experiences are all emerging from me together. It's hard to separate them. So Sue encouraged me to consider phenomenological research so I could further attend to these experiences and create literature that addresses cisnormativity in therapeutic practice. I initially set out to do interviews and attend to how folks might have learned micro skills as trans, intersex, two-spirit, or otherwise non-conforming people. However, I struggled to find phenomenological literature that frames cisnormativity as a phenomenon. I started with reading 50 Concepts for Critical Phenomenology, and in that book, they discuss heteronormativity, they discuss queer theory, they discuss ableism, amongst a lot of really important discussions about colonialism and white supremacy. And at the very end of the book, there's a chapter called Trans Phenomena, which in my understanding, trans phenomenology seems to focus on questions about why trans people exist or how we exist. And that just feels really problematic for a lot of reasons that I'll get into. So I decided not to rush through a study, especially because I didn't have ample theoretical grounding. And I also wanted to take time to reflect and ground myself in ways to where that I could actually nurture some important reflexivity as both a white person and a trans person who is a clinician. So I decided to write a philosophical inquiry detailing how phenomenological methods and concepts may be utilized to attend to cisnormativity as a part of the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy. And I also wanted this to detail and ground research that I want to engage in moving forward, and hopefully with others and in connection to research in music therapy. So why phenomenology? After reading almost half of 50 Concepts, I went to Wegel's book, Crafting Phenomenological Research, and I recognize that a lot of chapter 1 is based on how he summarizes a lot of phenomenological paradigms, and I hope to broaden my understanding of that, moving past this thesis. But for now, this is, what I had to work with. So he frames phenomenology as a study of the obvious. And in his words, it's a process of revealing things that have become so normal that we do not even notice what might be at work and what might be assumed. And I feel like that just really perfectly situates why this method is appropriate for attending to cisnormativity, especially because I continue to witness it emerging, especially when it's not named. And so Husserl is credited with coming up with phenomenological philosophy. His primary concern was from Cartesian mind-body dualism, and he argued that we can't study phenomena subjectively or objectively. We have to study them through our intentional relationship with the life world, which means that we're holding both the subjective and objective as intertwined, which they are. So he names 2 dominant research paradigms that I can't really get into now, but I'll kind of discuss them in the context of why I chose post-intentional phenomenology. So what is critical phenomenology? Gunther frames critical phenomenology as a way of both doing philosophy and a way of approaching activism, political activism, and it's a way of interpreting the world, but also wanting to change it. She talks about how in most phenomenological paradigms, there's an important aspect of moving from the natural attitude to the phenomenological attitude through a process. Typically the process for that is bracketing, and that's a process of suspending our presuppositions so that we can become more open to a phenomenon. Gunther argues that there are political and social structures that have compounded through time to organize and reproduce our natural attitudes, so that it's not only framing what we see, but it's literally creating the ways that we see and experience. And so critical phenomenology is about attending to the ways we experience and why and what that's in connection to, and not just what we see or experience. So many critical phenomenological philosophy iterations of it seem to be instigated by works of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Frantz Fanon. Many concepts also seem to incorporate post-structural theories and critical race theories. And while Wegel doesn't describe his paradigm as critical, and he also doesn't go into or really thoroughly discuss how critical race theory and Frantz Fanon have opened up critical phenomenology, he does ground his paradigm in Merleau-Ponty's theories and upon post-structural theorists, especially Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. So why did I choose post-intentional phenomenology for cisnormativity? So I find it to be frustrating to even think about wanting to get to create the essence cisnormativity. Husserl's paradigm and Heidegger's paradigm, Husserl is about finding the essence or the invariant structures of a phenomenon so that whatever makes the phenomenon what it is. And Heidegger's is a little bit more open, and it's about thinking about and creating or detailing the themes or manifestations of a phenomenon. But the way Wegel's paradigm centers phenomena is that a phenomenon is multiple, shifting, always incomplete and always partial. And I find that's really that really resonates with my experience of cisnormativity, because there really is no one perfect experience of cisnormativity. And to try to focus on detailing the essence of cisnormativity seems to enable a circular fixation on what it actually is, instead of opening us up to how it's provoked or produced through our bodies and through media, and how we may respond to it. And those are the questions that I want to center. So, and in doing so, his paradigm tries to decenter consciousness and decenter the need for human subjects. So this enables us to analyze how phenomena emerge, even if the phenomenon isn't being explicitly addressed or even noticed by subjects. And I think that's a great paradigm. That's a great way of attending to all forms of unconscious bias in care work. So, and additionally, because if we don't need human subjects, then we can also utilize media and arts as material. And I think that's a great invitation for creative arts therapists in particular, because we are already working with non-linguistic materials that can open us up to the way phenomena emerge outside of the visual. So lastly, this paradigm really allows us to acknowledge the temporal and contextual nature of systemic issues. We internalize systems of power both regardless of and because of our sociocultural and political experiences. And I believe that systems of power emerge through us regardless of our intention. And I think this paradigm allows us to frame that phrase of intention versus impact. And I think it also allows us to focus not just on how a phenomenon emerges and causes harm and creates this whole like victim perpetrator dichotomy, but also it allows us to recognize and attend to how we respond to and thwart these systems, which I think is very critical for instigating social change. So, all in all, I think this approach invites us to consider how internalized oppression emerges and how it offers us opportunities to rehabituate and uproot our internalizations. And we can do that without individualizing how a phenomenon moves through us as a personal problem. It seems to create a buffer towards this idealistic and individualistic way of thinking, oh, this person just did that, they're a bad person, I'm going to distance because something's inherently wrong with them, or they're inherently XYZ. I think it allows us to be in that ambiguous space of how systems can emerge from us, even if the system that's emerging from us harms us. So the dialogic process of post-intentional phenomenology is threefold. That involves post-reflexive journaling, which is Wegel's way of moving from the natural to the phenomenological attitude. He incorporates not bracketing, but Dahlberg and Dahlberg's concept of bridling as an alternative to bracketing. And bridling is more of a reflexive process that's ongoing. And it's both about suspending and acknowledging our presuppositions, and also being willing to let our experiences and our acute awareness of systems inform our analysis. So another part of his dialogic process is thinking with theories, and he asserts that we have to have a blend of phenomenological and post-structural theories, which I'll list in a moment what theories I incorporated. And he also asserts one theory has to involve a process that would bring about social change. The last part of this triangular dialogic process is his form of whole part whole analysis of the materials. So we're supposed to pick materials that are specific to varied and multiple contexts that the phenomenon emerges through, and it's not supposed to be all-encompassing. We are simply attending to how a phenomenon is emerging in one moment, in one time, in one context. And really, we're supposed to be attending to lines of flight, which Deleuze and Guattari frame as ways of thinking that break through borders of rigid thought, or borders of perhaps what we have culturally, what our cultural momentum is leading us to assume. And instead of trying to identify a cause and effect, we are invited to float in this state of becoming of a phenomenon, and be aware of yet resist that urge to pin down a phenomenon, or to label it, or to confine it. And from this process is supposed to emerge like productions and provocations of a phenomenon, which is Wegel's alternative to essence or themes. So instead of trying to, again, figure out what cisnormativity is, my process was more about articulating how cisnormativity is being produced through different materials in different contexts, and how it's being provoked. So these are the concepts that I go through in chapter 2, and I really try to describe them in ways that are accessible and that apply to not only care work literature, but just our experience as humans, and especially for folks who are growing up and through cultures that have been affected and are perpetuating colonial violence. So these are also theorists and concepts that I think with in chapter 2, and who I think with in chapter 3 as I get into analyzing materials. There are many more people that I think with along the way in chapter 3, but these folks seem to be the folks that I do the long haul analysis with. So the materials that I chose were a mix of media, just an assortment of different films, song, documentaries, and there are so much more. I mean, every time I watch something and I view any kind of work, I end up journaling about it because I notice something. And so a lot of my decisions for what to pick were, it was very difficult to pick what I wanted to write about now and what I wanted to write about later. So but I did purposely focus on materials that were created by people who were well-intended. I am not here to platform trans-exclusionary arguments. I'm also wanting to really illuminate how folks, even when they're well-intentioned, even when it's in their best interest to tend to a phenomenon, the phenomenon and systems of power emerge from us, and it can be very sneaky and very subversive. So I really wanted to illuminate that instead of go down the line of talking about how all these exclusionary arguments are so violent and here's why, because we don't need any more explanations as to why those arguments are terrible. So I also incorporated a lot of journal entries that emerge through different contexts that I find myself moving through in the world. And some experiences that informed my analysis, I will say, I didn't explain overtly, just out of respect for the privacy of my loved ones. But I do hope to attend to more of these in future work. So in chapter 3, I really get into first off, I go through a detailed historical context of how I understand cis normativity to have emerged through European patriarchy and then European informed colonization and white supremacy. And that's something I cannot summarize in a PowerPoint slide. So, so if we're talking about the emergences that I noticed of cis normativity, I noticed cisnormativity being produced through acts of dehumanization, typically imposed by the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal gaze. I also want to note that I noticed a lot of controlling imaginaries that tend to confine and fix trans and especially non-binary people as humanoids or monsters or animals, and especially those folks who are people of color. And I just want to name that, but I can't go into it right now, but that's just something I feel like is important to name. I was noticing productions related to responses to cisnormativity as double, quadruple, triple consciousness and aspects of dissociation. I was also noticing productions emerging through systemic erasure and epistemic injustice. Another conglomerate of productions I was noticing was just habituation to white supremacist heteropatriarchy through moving with the momentum of epistemological ignorance and knowledge and bad faith, the internalization of bioessentialism, moving through and from identity politics and these interesting requirements of pain and these processes of seeking privilege instead of liberation. And I've also noticed a lot of productions of cis heteropatriarchy through acts of white ontological expansiveness and white world traveling, especially as emerging through white trans people. So as far as productions are concerned, I noticed a lot of, provocations. I noticed a lot of provocations of cisnormativity as emerging through sites of epistemic friction, either through world traveling, through history to raise consciousness, or through reversing and even curdling the gaze through a guerrilla pluralist resistance. And again, this is going back to that theory of change that I tried to latch onto was Medina's theory of epistemological resistance. Both of these forms and provocations seem to both provoke like vehement violence against trans, two-spirit, intersex, and otherwise non-conforming people. And these seem to implore us to hesitate, which Al-Saji and her theories frames hesitation and pausing as a way of slowing the momentum of colonial violence, of colonial epistemological ignorance and knowledge. And by slowing down and hesitating, we can redevelop habits that see, touch, and listen in ways that are loving and witnessing instead of ways that are imposing upon people and restricting their subjectivity. So in chapter 4, I'm like, how does this apply to counseling research? So I go through these theories a little bit and more just to contextualize how I don't think what I'm talking about or bringing up is new to music therapy. I did want to illuminate how all these lines of flight could be extended into discussions and more nuanced consideration for how trans, two-spirit, intersex, and otherwise non-conforming clinicians move through and habituate to resist to cisnormativity. So why do I feel like this is important for care work research? Well, we need to consider how cisnormativity emerges, impacts, influences the clinical relationship, because we've already established that therapists need to work to transform their epistemological ignorance and knowledge. And I know I've used that term a lot. I will briefly say that it's framed this way because a lot of times people think, oh, I hear people say all the time, oh, that person's just XYZ ableist term, and they're uneducated, or they are just quote unquote stupid, or other ableist slurs, and that's why they're ignorant. But it's really important that we understand that ignorance is not based on what we don't know, it's based on how we know, what we know, and how we know it. And so a lot of therapists in institutional colonial care work settings, we know what we know because of theories that have been informed and are rooted in colonial violence. And so we really, really need to transform all of the way that we think and what knowledges and ways of moving through the world that we're informed by as clinicians. We need to frame how the internalization of white supremacist heteronormativity or patriarchy is an emergence of sociocultural context. Like, as Sue continues to remind all of us in our cohort, we are all social cultural beings, and no one is neutral, and acts of neutrality are actually acts of violence. So if we want to shift the culture of care work, we need to allow for and be open to a reemergence of paradigms of gender that are not based in the colonial gender paradigm. If we continue to essentially use the tools of the colonial gender paradigm, then any shifts within biosocial fields will be superficial. Lastly, I think the well-being of all people, especially trans, two-spirit, intersex, and otherwise non-conforming people, and especially those who are people of color, requires that we have a complex consideration of cis heteropatriarchy be reflected in supervisory literature and general clinical approaches. We need more than inconsistent and superficial language changes and some revised editions of textbooks. That's just that. How does this inform phenomenological care work literature? I could go into this in a whole PowerPoint, but I really feel like we need to consider phenomenology in more complex ways. There's more than just one phenomenological research paradigm. And if we become open to that, then we can attend to a vaster topography of questions. And there are really beautiful concepts that I list in chapter 2 that emerge from phenomenology and post-structural work that we could utilize to articulate our analysis and to actually contribute to social change. We need to more clearly articulate phenomena that we center and explain our process of phenomenological reduction and moving from the natural to the phenomenological attitude more clearly. We need to do that before we engage in research. And we need to become open to how systems temporally emerge through therapeutic relationships specific to their contexts, and instead of just focusing on the beings in the relationship, and in particular, instead of just focusing on the clients in the relationship. We need to shift away from questions that ask what phenomena are and towards how phenomena emerge and how they can be responded to. And I feel like we could become more open to not requiring somebody to be X identity enough before they are considered as a participant for certain studies. I think we need to be more open to how phenomena move through all of us, regardless of and because of our contexts. And again, Bratt reminds us that we need to attend to the therapeutic relationship more in research. And I realized I did not type all the date there, so I'll do that later. Lastly, there is a lovely invitation to incorporate arts-based approaches in phenomenological research. And I think that could not only inform or broaden the scope of music therapy research, but I think it could actually inform academic, like phenomenological philosophical research, because a lot of that research is still very focused on the visual field and linguistics. And I think that's limiting to what phenomenology could open us up to. And then across all research, we need to just agree that white supremacist heteropatriarchy affects everyone, not just trans people. And I really wonder what it would like to be to reframe discussions of gender depression and sexism to discussions of cis heteropatriarchy. Like what could happen, who all could be considered in interactions that are falling in the gaps right now when we just talk about sexism or gender depression, if we shift to talking about cis heteropatriarchy or thinking of it in that way. And also just in general, if researchers want to attend to any form of bioessentialism, I really believe that all forms of bioessentialism must be attended to at once. That means participant context needs to be held, and participants need to be an active part of the analysis process, or else we'll just be re-perpetuating the bioessentialism that we're trying to center. Now, the following research ideas that I'm going to try to breeze through. Before I get to them, I want to name that I think all these ideas would best be performed in groups of researchers, and that those researchers all be folks who emerge through varied historical cultural contexts. And I think that would be helpful so that we can decenter consciousness, so we can challenge unconscious bias, and we can enable the process of gathering participants across a wider breadth of sociocultural experiences. And similarly, I feel like needs to be more than one research group that attends to these ideas. We need a plurality of projects, because I believe there are a plurality of resistances that are emerging across the world. And all of those sites of resistance need to be attended to by people in that context. And so that means that I can't be a part of all of them, and I really don't want to be a part of all of them. I don't think it would be helpful or beneficial. So some of the ideas I discussed in chapter 4, one of them is about engaging in a lot of broad literature reviews, because we really, again, like I said, we need to attend to how our knowledge and how our knowledge frameworks and how all of our research continues to emerge from historically very violent, colonial, institutionalized ways of thinking and ways of framing humanness. And so we really need to slow down and attend to how research perpetuates that, and how some forms of researchers are actually trying to resist against that, so we can learn from those folks who are already doing that work. Now, I also think there are a lot of different ideas that can emerge from post-intentional phenomenology that can be done as participatory action research. I'm really drawn to attending to habits of voicing and habits of listening through gender affirming voice work with therapy participants and music therapists. I really think this could open us up to ways to how white supremacist normativity, how we habituate it, how we habituate to it through sensory perceptual fields besides the visual, and ways we seek to shift or thwart internalized white supremacist cisnormativity. And additionally, I have some different ideas for peer supervision projects or affinity group processing, where we can become open to ways of developing clinical rapport that integrate contexts of gender embodiment and in ways that resist imperialist white supremacist heteropatriarchy. And lastly, I am also feeling drawn to interviewing music therapists and students, whether they be ex or current. So just to get an idea of how cisnormativity might emerge and how resistance to it might emerge in the development of clinical micro skills. And again, because cisnormativity affects everyone, I would prioritize trans, two-spirit, intersex, and otherwise non-conforming people, but I would not limit the participants to only those folks who are out. I feel like it's important to interview many people across experiences of bioessentialist privilege and oppression, because we are all affected and socialized by cis heteropatriarchy. And as a disclaimer, I think all of this is going to shift and become more complex and be reworked as I engage and witness more, and especially works by and for trans, two-spirit, and intersex folks. I made a promise to myself at the beginning of this year that I wouldn't read anymore and just write. And of course, right after that, I found all these really lovely books. And so I have a list and I'm prepared. I'm so ready to dig in. And this doesn't even cover the phenomenological stuff that I want to read about and the post-structural stuff I want to read about. So I really hope that my work conveys how urgent it is for care workers to slow down and open up to the ways this heteronormativity emerges and the ways we can retroactively and proactively shift these dynamics. And I also hope that this enables others to nurture their reflexivity and resistance to bioessentialist oppression through attending to relationships and holding consideration for the more than visual. And these are references. And yes, thank you. Again, I really appreciate everybody. I really couldn't have, this would not have been possible without all of y'all. So that is that.
Thank you very much, and congratulations.
Thanks.
To distill 230 pages down into 25 minutes. Is, you know, a minute per 10 pages. Excellent.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I was looking at the timer, I was like, damn it, hit 30. I was really trying to get it to 25, but it's fine, you know.
You might have started a bit later than you thought, but yes. Okay, well, great work. I'm going to turn it over to your readers to make some comments, ask some questions. So we will start with Bill. See how I made that? I was just gonna shorten the whole sentence. We will start with Bill.
Thank you. Rae, it's just been a joy dialoguing with you during this process. It's been illuminating for me. It's really neat to see such a wonderfully ambitious project taken on with such thought and care. So I'd like to start with that.
Thank you.
I have some really questions that are just dialogue, just like what we've been doing over email. And I'd like to start with this idea about post-intentional phenomenology and arts-based considerations, or the use of the considerations of the music or musicking itself in the process. I'd really just like to hear what's running through your mind, because this is something I've been thinking about a little bit as well.
Yeah, I have so many different thoughts that just continue to tangle up with each other. I find myself, so in my work with folks in gender affirming voice work, I'm finding this coming up a lot, where we are thinking about voicing and musicking as a process, which I mean is not new to music therapy, but it's I think in conjunction with the ways that shifting habit works as a process. And I find myself like wanting to record like sessions with folks and go back to some of like the harmonies that we're using in dialogue with the person's voice, and maybe even like I'm working with one person who's doing songwriting too, and doing some really lovely work with that, and just engaging with their songwriting process and building and developing more musically with that. And then from that, maybe engaging with Brusha's improvisational analysis framework, and dialoguing with the participant on, you know, what they're noticing emerging and what they're noticing shifting at session to session. There are also a lot of folks that are really wanting to attend to and notice the way that internalized cis heteronormativity is emerging from them in ways that cause them harm, and in ways that they want to shift in relationship to themselves, and in ways that help them resist cisnormativity and help them challenge and intentionally cause friction with these dynamics. And so I think a lot of my ideas are just going to be based on the relationship with each person. And I'm hoping this is answering the question. And I also am somebody who I don't really have a lot of practical experience with arts-based research. Like, I've read a lot, I really love it, I really love the ideas of it, and I also find myself getting like stuck in analytical loops of if I'm doing it right, or if this is actually yada yada arts-based. But I think in like the process of analysis and thinking of and considering just the musical and the sound and the textural aspects could really open us up to into ways that we assume gender, and the ways that we assume different dynamics based on sound and based on timbres, and also how the way our assumptions don't actually align with how we're perceived. I was, talking with someone a few weeks ago, and she was with a lot of like cis women friends, and she was telling them about how she was, doing voice work. And she got out her little voice app, and she noticed that all of cis women were voicing at pitches lower than she was. And she was like, what the heck? Like, I feel so duped. Like, I've been like shaming myself for not speaking high enough. And then like these women are all speaking lower than me. And I'm like, yeah, isn't it amazing? Like, trans women are held to such an intense double standard. And if you were to put cis women up to that standard, especially white cis women, oh my goodness, like they would fail. And so just those little moments, I think if that was recorded, going back to that and finding ways of like creating music or creating sound that illuminated that juxtaposition would be really lovely. So that's just one thought, but I think depending on the person and depending on their context, there can be so many ways to work with this, like through songwriting, through dance. I really love the idea of getting a lot of creative art therapists together and just literally analyzing media, analyzing movies, analyzing plays, and doing different arts-based research based on that, because I think there's so much that we are informed by through media that we don't really consciously consider. So
Thank you. By all means.
Sorry, can I just follow up on two little aspects of that for you to think through a bit more, Rae?
Yes.
And that is, if you were to use the IAPs,
yes.
Brusha analyzes improvisations through existential theory or through psychoanalysis kind of things. And those seem like not what you would necessarily do. So I'm wondering whether you would bring some other form of analysis that would be more, I don't know, but that maybe some of the things you're thinking with.
No, that's a great question. I really feel a lot of complex feelings about psychoanalysis because, again, of the ways it's rooted in colonial gender paradigms that are just really, really gross, really toxic, really violent. And I also think that there are a lot of people who have utilized aspects of psychoanalytic theory in ways that seek to transform or like illuminate those discrepancies. And so I would want to find those works and let their understanding of psychoanalysis inform the IOPs and maybe not necessarily Bruscia's interpretation of psychoanalysis. So there would be a lot of dialoguing, I think, that would have to occur. And that's why I also feel like doing this in groups would be really important, because there's only so much that I can learn and take on. And I think things are best emerged when in dialogue with others. But I think that's a really great point.
Yeah, and the other point I was going to make was in terms of you were saying like engaging with all these different art forms, and I'm wondering if there's something in terms of disseminating research through art forms that could be quite emancipatory and help people who aren't going to necessarily understand all this philosophy, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
through some other ways, and what you think about that.
Oh yeah, no, I think one aspect I really love about participatory action and in most like community-based research projects is that aspect of sharing things and platforming. I feel very dedicated to making all these different philosophical jargony things accessible. And I find a lot of people, like when I read this stuff, I'm like, oh, that's the word for that. I felt that, I've thought that, cool, there's a word for that, sweet. But you know, we don't have to just do that word for it. But I think I think acknowledging and bringing that work in through art forms and in conversation, I find myself constantly hearing these theories spoken back to me by people from their context, from their understandings, without them maybe even realizing that it is, you know, a theory in some textbook. So I try to like be in the space that liminal space of being informed by what I'm informed by. And also not trying to seek to be like, oh, that's that. I'm going to pin that word on that. But because of what I know, I want to bolster when people speak to those things and when people share those things in their own way. And because that's the importance, that's the transformative power of this is harnessing the power of our double consciousness, and not necessarily harnessing, I don't actually gonna reframe that word. I think being fed and nourished and moved by our double consciousness and the power of our double consciousness is the way that we're going to transform systems. And we don't have to have fancy words for it. But I do think the fancy words can illuminate some ways that we can do it. So it's a weird balance.
Rae, it's interesting to think about some of our prior dialogue as well. You know, I'm thinking of Deleuze and Guattari and their critique of Lacan and Freud, flipping psychoanalysis on its head through schizoanalysis.
Yes.
This consideration of double consciousness that you speak, these things kind of connect in interesting ways. So it's an interesting dovetail.
It is.
To consider. You know, I guess along those similar lines, I think you've done a wonderful job articulating and noticing in the midst of your writing, there's something within this that I still want to look for, which makes it really hard, right? Because you're continually like deeper and deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you did more recently in the manuscript was you situated Heidegger a bit. Yes. and really looked critically at some things. Mm-hmm. Have you had a chance to situate Deleuze and Guattari yet?
Not completely. No, honestly, like I have learned more about Deleuze and Guattari through folks that not necessarily summarize, but think with. Like I've learned a lot about Deleuze and Guattari through Weigel. I've learned a lot about them through some articles that situate and more easily summarize schizoanalysis. And I also know that there are critiques to be held about them. And I know that there is a relationship. I know there's a relationship between like Nazism and Nietzsche. and the way Nietzsche was then basically like marked as fascist, as a Nazi, even though Nietzsche's work was co-opted by the Nazis. And then Deleuze and Guattari went back to Nietzsche and actually tried to uncover and develop their works in ways that are, not aligned with fascism. So like I know that there is some kind of context there, but I would love any resources or any like thoughts about their situatedness.
Sure. And I think I probably didn't articulate very well that consideration of situating anyone can include both the critique and also just the illumination of things. It might also reinforce what one is trying to communicate. One of the things that comes across to me that might be beneficial is a writing by Deleuze. It's called A Letter to a Harsh Critic, and you can look it up online.
Okay.
That would be something to read through, and probably try to find some people who talk through it beyond just the letter itself too at some point. Just an initial thought as a part of this situating the different people that you're using as lenses. Is that a fair?
Yes, no, I think that's fair. I appreciate the way Deleuze and Guattari try to articulate the harm of psychoanalysis and the harm of institutionalization, and the way that's also weaponized against African diasporic folks in particular. And one of my projects is to become more deeply situated with their context, especially in relationship to like folks like Foucault, who had such like a nihilism about humanity that a lot of his works ended up just kind of informing the way fascist surveillance is occurring now. It's like it's hard whenever you're trying to work against colonial powers and the way your work gets co-opted by colonial powers. So there's a lot of stuff to try to be illuminated by and situated by.
Yeah. Stu, I want to be mindful of time. I have one more potential question, but if I need to defer to other people, I'm more than happy to do that.
I'll take the question. I want to give each reader about 20 minutes. So you're almost at
almost there. All right, last question. Thank you. At some juncture, if you are hopeful, then I am also hopeful with you that you are seeking to publish what I would assume would be portions of this manuscript in different arenas as you feel. I think very much so that the material is there to do that with. And of course, the way many journals work is that you have to become quite concise in process and so on. And I'm not defending that or attacking it. I'm just noting it. So my question, I suppose, is in some way related to that idea. What concept or concepts do you feel you at this point are most resonating with as a potential anchor for a manuscript?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually had to write, I decided to write a proposal for the International Marlupani Circle that Helen Yo and a few others are holding a talk about rethinking racism. And in doing so, I had to create a proposal that was 3,500 words or less. And that was quite a fun little challenge. And in doing so, I found that I chose Helen Yo's work in particular because her work synthesizes so much of the theories that I feel drawn to. And I also feel very informed by Snorton's analysis and of history and of trans identity. And I feel very, very moved by Lujones and world traveling and by ideas of white ontological expansiveness, but all of those thoughts kind of work into Nyo's theory. So it's a hard balance of going with Nyo, but also wanting to in particularly like focus on some of the aspects of these other concepts that are important. And another one, I really feel like it's become really close to me, is Alsage's concept of jure. I feel like that's a really beautiful way of describing generational momentum, and I think it could be very, very lovely and informative to music therapy as well. So I feel like those theories are, and also obviously Medina's epistemological resistance. I think so that little cluster of theories seems to be ones that I'm like really honing in on. And then keep on adding and then obviously, like in chapter 3, we notice like I am very, very informed and inspired by Alok Menon's work. And I feel like their work is so critical to my analysis that I would always want to defer to their works. And I mean, a lot of the historical section is from their labor and is from their intellectual labor. And they do such a beautiful job of synthesizing all these amazing concepts, all these really dense concepts into art that speaks to those concepts through their experience. And I just feel like they're an inspiration for arts-based work. They're an inspiration for theoretical work. And I also don't like calling them inspirational because they critique that, they critique that this idea of exceptionalism. So, but I do want to highlight that their work has been very foundational and important. So.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for your questions and feedback, Bill. I really appreciate all of the work that you put into this. All right, who's next?
Do we have a preference, Natalia? Would you like to go next?
Who else is with us that is
Thank
reader?
you.
Ooh, I definitely want to listen to them. I'm honestly either way.
Natalia, you're already speaking. So if it's cool with you,
Yeah, I shall take it.
Sweet. Also, I want to open it up like so that each person gets 20 minutes. Is it okay if we like go to like 2:35 just so that each reader gets that 20 minutes? Because I went over.
I'm okay with that.
Over the time I was trying to allot. Okay.
Yeah,
Sweet.
I'm okay with that.
Awesome.
So we said that I'm going next?
Yes.
Okay, my brain. All right. So I'm really excited. And I wanted to say in the group as well that I'm very, very honored that you thought of me. And also, that this is very close to my heart, very personally in my family, with my kiddos and all that stuff. So because I am who I am as a human and also as a clinician, it is really beautiful to see a work that really tries really hard to let go of the fragmentation that a lot of times we're taught, right? Of like, you're a blank slate as a clinician. And I love the deconstruction of that. I'm here for it. I think it's like the most that I do, right? And with that being said, I was listening to you earlier talking about like subjective versus objective, right? And like I automatically went to that thought process of, again, we're in that binary thinking, even when they're trying to like define like what is quote unquote an opinion versus what is quote unquote a fact, right? Yeah. And how that is not generalizable across cultures. So like when I was trying to think, because I'm very much about like, what do I do with this information? Like, where can I continue the work and where I exist already, right? And so just for the sake of everybody knowing, I work with people from all over the world, a bunch of different languages, a bunch of different cultures, and they're all seeking asylum, or they've been victims of crime. So there's a very trauma-focused kind of space. And one of the things that I learned in there quickly was that me being a Black Latina who's queer doesn't automatically make me competent, right? It doesn't automatically make me able to actually create a space where other people are willing to take the risk, right? Because I don't believe in safety in therapy. I believe in creating a space, co-creating a space where people are willing to take that risk to show themselves as who they are, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to also kind of dance with in that subjective, objective, binary thinking is the need for pronouns across cultures.
Mm.
So in Jamaica, there is absolute hate and complete like unsafety, right? When it comes to being queer. I have a few people from Jamaica, and the things that they've been put through just because of that, from their own parents, from their own family, right? Not that different from here, but like culturally, it is something that is a very big deal in Jamaica. And one thing that is not like even in that space is what pronouns are.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
I have, and I really kind of like had this moment, and I want to kind of like have this as a conversation, because again, I don't have the answer, but I had this moment because the two people that I have from Jamaica right now are both queer. And so it is also our need necessarily to like impose that they should have a need to define themselves in a way so that I can identify who they are, right? Like by my own definition. And so I just wanted to kind of like have a little short conversation about that, because when I spoke to specifically, you know how in your intakes and all that stuff, right? You're like pronouns, how should we address you and all that stuff. And he was like, well, I am gay, but like, I only know he and she. Like, what is there, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that like, as I was listening to, I'm like, well, shit. Yeah, like I'm definitely in that clinical space of, do I provide information about here, right? Because this is how we operate here, but that's not a thing in Jamaica.
And even only some places in the US do we operate that way. And I feel like pronouns have become so weaponized, and like in particular, it seems like there's been so much focus again on like superficial language shifts, or, oh, I put a question asking for pronouns on my form, so I'm inclusive now, I'm a safe space now. And like you said, I mean, asking for pronouns sometimes can be jarring, and especially if coming from cultures that have so much internalized white supremacy and so much internalized internalized policing of gender and sexuality, to the point where pronouns aren't even a question. It's like gender is not even a question. It's the colonial gender paradigm says I'm this, and this is how I go, and it's immutable, it's fixed. And so like I relate, I resonate with like this struggle of like, where's the line of psychoeducation, and at what point am I pushing quote unquote an agenda, and at what point am I, you know, making the space open enough for folks to consider something that they haven't even given themselves permission to consider. And I think that's a really beautiful question and a really beautiful example, Natalia, of this quandary. Like I find myself being open and like saying, hey, I use these pronouns. What pronouns do you use? And then whatever that person said, well, I've always just used he, that's all I know. That lets us know where this person is coming from. And then I think from there, it's a question of like, do they want to know anymore? Like, you know, are you curious about what it means to use they them pronouns, or what it means to like use these other pronouns? Do you want to know that? And if, you know, asking if that's even something they want to know, I think can then go into whether or not we talk about it. And I also find myself a lot like situating habit, you know, especially after like going through these different theories and recognizing how it can be like very disorienting to suddenly have to consider pronouns when you have instilled a habit of looking at somebody and assuming something and going with it. You know, there's so many different aspects of habit that really need to shift in order to make ourselves open to essentially, like, I say essentially sarcastically, like reformulating how we interact socially. And it can be really hard. You know, I know people can get frustrated when folks don't get they them pronouns that quickly, but like it's a cognitive process. It is a very sedimented habit. And I think if we hold space for that and say, hey, like, look, I recognize that this is something that's hard. And also, like, is this something that you want to become open to? Because we can work on that if you want to work on that. And yeah, so no, what are you responding? What's your response to that as I'm saying
well,
this?
my thing is also, because I'm trauma focused and I do a lot of non-music therapy stuff as well, there's this kind of lingering worry, right, about how tied is it to like their trauma, right? This person's trauma, and like the fact that survival, right, was the most priority, and that's why they're here, right? And like now I have to figure out how much of the melting pot I'm gonna be on top of everything, right? Because I usually say, like, when we really think about the melting pot, in my experience as a non-American, like raised in the island, is like you melt into whiteness. So you have to choose what parts of yourself you think you have to mute based on how am I going to assimilate and fit in, right? And we know that acculturation and assimilation are different things. And so sometimes we can coexist and we can share, right, like myself within this space. But yeah, it's just something that I'm continuously curious and humbled from, because it could really be a space for you could really fuck somebody up, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah, an identity crisis, you know, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
No, and I think thinking about that from like an aspect that's healing centered or trauma informed is asking, I think from there, asking like what they understand about gender, or like what, like, and then going from there, being curious about and attending to how gender might be imbued through experiences of trauma. And I mean, I feel like from there, I tend to find or try to reflect on maybe tiny little like discrepancies, or like when folks say something that's a value judgment about them that's based on gender binary. I respond to it, I try to respond to it with curiosity. I'm like, did somebody tell you that? Like, is that something that, you know, that is attached to like a traumatic event, or is that just a part of some relational traumatic patterns between family members? Like, and over time, like basically trying to hold a space where folks actually feel comfortable, hopefully feel comfortable enough with just acknowledging some of the things that they've learned that harm themselves, and that maybe they're expecting other people to attend to internalize because they went through that harm, you know, like, oh, this is just how I was raised, and everybody needs to go through this pain now. This is just what everybody goes through. And like really trying to sit with and unpack those things without having necessarily an agenda, or instituting like this idea that I'm judging somebody because of their opinions or because of what they've internalized. Because like you said, they've done what they've had to do so far to survive.
Exactly.
And like they bringing this back to some of the like work I'm finding myself in with gender affirming voice work. There are a lot of people that come in and they feel ashamed for how much they want to pass and how much they want to habituate and just fit in. They feel ashamed for the ways that they don't feel like they're trans enough because they still pretend to be the gender that they are expected to be at work. And they feel even afraid. A lot of times they're like, I'm sorry, I want to say something, but I'm afraid of insulting you. And I was like, hey, just I welcome it. You know, let's talk about it. This is, you know, and I try to always reiterate, these are things that we've had to do in order to survive. And our bodies and our relationships to ourselves might have internalized a lot of things that hurt us, but like we can reestablish our relationships with those parts of ourselves. And in doing that, in order to do that, we have to become open to what we know and have internalized so far. Right.
The process of deconstructing, which is oftentimes, you know, including grief as well. So like that whole thing, you know, it's definitely multi-layered. In that same space of accessibility and like, how do I take this information in and like continue to bring it, you know, wherever it is that I'm navigating. I don't know if you know this, you probably do, but like when it comes to scholarly writing as defined by academia, I've always been against it, because I think it's very elitist and it really removes access from people. Kind of like what Sue was saying earlier, right? Like, you know, how do we get this information out to people who didn't go to fucking college?
Yeah.
Right. And so how do we get this out for like kiddos and youth, right? Because maybe it saves lives. You know what I mean? Is that serious? And so I was wondering, you know, like in terms of your future, right, of your projects, not to not to burden you with it, but like the world needs it. Just layman's terms, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
is there something that could make, is there a way to make this like I can buy a book, you know, that has some of this information in, you know?
Yeah. I want to get to a point. I feel like right now I'm in the stage of literally just, I hate to use this expression, and I know it could bring up different like eating disorder stuff, but word vomiting. I feel like
No,
I
I
feel
get
like
that.
I feel like right now I've had so many different thoughts and ideas that I've continued to not find in literature that I just needed to get out.
Mhm.
And I'm really hoping that through, I don't necessarily want to refine so much as I want to find ways of dialoguing about this that are accessible. And I feel like doing that requires me talking about it in groups
Yeah.
and finding other ways of attending to and describing these experiences. And at the same time, I feel like it's important to name things like cis heteropatriarchy. Like that's a big
Right.
word, but
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
we, you know, I feel like we've got to name it. And I
Mhm.
think the only way some of these words or these phrases of jargon can become less elitist is by talking about them and by incorporating them more
Yeah.
in what we talk about outside of the academy. So there's like this really
Yeah.
weird line of there's just a really weird line. And I'm also thinking right now about Bell Hooks and the way that she
Mhm.
does such a really lovely job of taking these really, really intense concepts and making them accessible to communities and holding spaces and communities where she talks amongst her community and discusses these. And I think part of that kind of fuels what I want to do as far as some of these different affinity group projects where we're just
Mhm.
gathering together and we're talking about these concepts and these things. And then from there, I feel like a lot of ways of describing this can emerge that are more accessible. But I don't think that that's something that I can do alone. Like
Oh, I hear you. I hear you. I think it would be delusional, to be honest. Like, and I appreciate your humility.
yes.
Absolutely. That kind of leads me to thinking about my White Aspiring Allies course, right?
Yes.
And I'm also teaching this, my first graduate course. I'm very excited, but I digress.
Yeah.
But thinking about being able to apply, right? Like I read this 2 months ago and we're using it today, boom, you know? And so I was really wondering, like in terms of thinking about people who may need a lot more of deconstructing in education in order to actually be in a space where they can take your thesis in, right? And so that's where I come in. And so I'm really trying to like, you know, get my wheels turning because one of the exercises or one of the things that I was wondering about is like a reinvented like Venn diagram. And I say reinvented very intentionally because it's definitely not going to look like how it was originally made, but like having, and I also wonder about your experience and your perception before starting your thesis and now, like having these themes visually and imagery wise presented and like, so for example, we can have like patriarchy and we can have cis heteronormative culture, and then we can have white feminism. And I say white feminism very specifically and intentionally because I've experienced the difference, right? Like, yeah, in terms of how harmful it can be. And so like having that be present, having like the opportunity to add like color to it, having the opportunity to shift the spaces, like where do these shapes overlap? Are they going to be circles? Like really delving into like the whole brain kind of like experience, and kind of like seeing what can be done musically with it as a reference, right? Like a referential improvisation kind of thing. And so I was just like, that's the one thing that I kind of want to try, but like, I don't know, like, what are your thoughts on that kind of like making sure that we also work on preparing and kind of pushing, and I say pushing intentionally too, like for that growth and that transformation and that deconstruction so that people can actually read your thesis and be like, oh yeah, I'm taking that shit in, as opposed to like,
Give me a minute. Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. I love me a complex Venn diagram. I love me a good complex Venn diagram. I also feel like there are plenty of like graphics and Venn diagrams out in the world that just need to be tweaked a little bit. And that's the thing with me is I find myself, I'm always just like, oh, that's so close, but it's not close enough. Like, oh, I just want to add a word here. I want to shift this here. And I feel like we can easily find different, Venn diagrams or graphs or charts out in the world and just shift them a little bit to make them a little bit more nuanced and hold more space for the undertones of cisnormativity, because again, they seem to emerge through all these different forms of bioessentialism in ways that tend to go unnamed. And I think instead of just creating something else, I'm really drawn to going through and recreating or shifting what's already out there.
Right.
I really love the idea of then doing a referential like music thing for it. And also, Natalia, I've been thinking about your course a lot because I really love the way you encourage, you pick out very specifically like music videos or different aspects of literature, and you ask people to experience it and then journal about it. And I think that could easily translate pedagogically to some of the things that I'm bringing up here. There are so many songs that I listed that could be taken in more than just lyric wise and discussed. Absolutely. And, and so I would love to think and consider this more with you. One of the reasons why I asked you to be a reader is just because of the way you formulated your course and because of your very intentional way of pedagogically guiding through and pushing people to challenge their internalized thoughts and recognize that these systems emerge from us regardless of our intention. So I love those ideas.
Yeah, I think I would also love to see, and thank you for saying that, by the way. That's really kind of you. I felt it in my heart. But the other thing too, I know I'm almost out of time, or did I pass it? I'm sorry.
You're right at it, but just finish your thought. I want to hear it.
Well, now I kind of lost it. So let's just finish, and then I'll like FaceTime you through Messenger and be like, I remember.
Sounds great. That sounds
you get a voice memo, it's me.
While you were talking about that Venn diagram, I had this image in my head because Venn diagrams have all those things separately, right? And they sort of intersect. But remember those toys that are like all those linked bits that they come together in kind of a ball, and then you can like different colors. It's almost like all your different parts of your identity are in that.
Those are really fun to play with.
I love that. I love that so much. Why do I want to make
I don't know what they're called, but you know what I'm talking about.
I know Herman loves it. Yeah. That's really cool, because I was looking at the circles that you had in your presentation, like the image that I don't know if you chose intentionally, but I was like, oh, like look at these like things carefully placed, like how are they related to each other? So yeah, that's kind of like where I was going with it.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'd love to think through this more and maybe develop something with you. That would be great.
Thank you, Natalia.
Yeah, so many things so many different threads. My mind's kind of spinning on, but thank you, Rae, for inviting me to be a reader. I know it's been a bit of a wild ride in some of the back and forth with trying to read and sink my teeth into your work, and I've enjoyed it. I'm just on the heels of coming out of a month-long residency and tour, and Natalia, as you were speaking in the dialogue you were having about pronouns and language and kind of global perspectives around gender and different cultural norms around that, I think became quite illuminated for me in a very concentrated way over the last month. So I'm going to start there, Rae, just by thanking you, but also tagging on to that thought, because I had some really beautiful conversations with people who became siblings of mine, who identify as queer, who live in places in parts of southern and northern Brazil or rural South Africa, and how when I was talking about my they pronoun, they were like, well, it's she or he for me, so you're he, and having conversations about and it's like, and I don't mean any harm, but it opened up some really lovely conversations, which you were talking about, these understandings of gender. And like, I think your project, your research, I think has a really lovely way and potential for facilitating these kinds of conversations and discourse, which, you know, we're talking about today. But I was just brought to that particular thought, and just thoughts around pronouns, thoughts around language. And in your writing, you talk about moving away from non-binary as a term for yourself, and embracing pangender. And I'm wondering if you feel comfortable talking about it. I was curious about that, just your thoughts and thinking around it, and how you've come to like embrace that for yourself, and even your thought process.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's a lovely question. I I will say that thought kind of emerged from a lot of different conversations, some conversations I've had with Sue, some different speeches and presentations I've heard Alok give about, in one particular presentation they gave, I think to Middle Church, they talked about how when they say that they're non-binary, they're saying non-binary in reference to what? Like, I'm still centering my identity in reference to the colonial gender binary. And when you define someone as gender nonconforming, which I tried to like intentionally not say in the thesis and not say in my presentation, it's almost like if someone's labeled as gender nonconforming because they're conforming to their gender, why are they labeled as gender nonconforming? So yeah, there's just, I think, especially with English in particular, just the value system of the colonial value systems, you know, this it can be hard to talk about gender in ways that don't other all of the different genders that are in our experienced. And so yeah, I've continuously felt like a friction with understanding myself as non-binary, and I still say it because in this time, in this place, like, my gender still is understood underneath the umbrella of non-binary, and that's fine. You know, I'll live with that, but I want to hold the complexity that I don't necessarily like. There are so many non-genders that are not a part of the binary. They're in between man and woman. They encompass man and woman. They are outside and around man and woman. They are none of the above. They aren't a gender. And so non-binary is such a cluster of genders that I find it helpful for me personally, to consider like how I actually experience gender, and find words that have a more nuanced understanding of what gender means for me and my experience. And, you know, the trans language primer, man, I have loved this index. And it's been something I've been following for at least 5 or 6 years in its development. And I actually found that term pangender through that, because it's just a really lovely conflagration of all of these different trans people talking about gender and formulating words that illuminate their identity. And so pangender, in my understanding, is like pangender is an experience of being all of them at once. And like, I don't necessarily consider myself a gender fluid person. I don't find that one day I am one gender and the next day I am another. I find a lot of times that I'm constantly fluctuating and being seen through all of the genders. And I mean, whenever I talk with people, especially when I first meet people, sometimes they even say that. They're like, wow, like I am literally every second I am seeing something else come out of you and come through you. And of course that's loaded, that's loaded again with gender essentialism and binary essentialism. And also I feel like hearing that from so many different people resonates and illuminates like my experience of gender and how that is read to the world and how that is read by the world. Yeah, one of my favorite uncomfortable yet somehow not uncomfortable interactions that I have with clients, especially folks in hospice who are experiencing dementia, and they honestly are more aware of their surroundings than a lot of neurotypical people are. I've been called ma'am sir multiple times. They're like, I don't know what to call you, man, woman, ma'am sir. And just like, they're just constantly like shifting, you know, and using different pronouns for me in the same conversation. And I'm just like, wow, I feel so validated by this right now, because like, they're just, it's so, again, it's, I'm hoping that this explanation is helpful. I think it can be really easy to think about non-binary. I see a lot of people, the way they talk about non-binary gender as if it's one gender, and as if it necessitates intersex experience and it necessitates androgyny. And it almost seems like this way of, instead of having the 2 tracks for man and woman, there's a 3rd track in the middle, and you just got to fit that track completely. And I'm just like, I don't want any more tracks. I don't just leave the tracks alone, because they're all crap anyway. Like everybody's reproductive organs are different, and we should just stop gendering organs. We just should stop. We should stop putting so much faith in what we perceive and how that connects to organs. Like it's ludicrous. So yeah, that's where that comes from. Yeah.
Thank you, Rae. No, agreed. Totally answered the question. And I very much appreciate the terminology. And I think I lifted that up, and just your rationale, and was curious, to hear you speak more about that. You talked about the 2 tracks, the binary tracks, the 3rd of the middle. And sometimes you just want to put a jetpack on and fly out of there, to a whole other different constellation of gender expansive experience.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you for sharing more about that. Bill actually put out one of the things I wanted to ask you about. I was super curious about arts-based, processes, explorations, like other ways you might, or that you've been thinking about or might consider exploring some of these topics, through artistic practice, through arts-based processes. And so you spoke to some of that already, and I'm happy to hop on if I have other questions or things come up, to hop on a FaceTime about it, because I think because so much of the philosophy, the terms, the language, the constructs, right, they can be so dense, right, and with respect to various levels of education and knowledge and access to understanding these things at face value. And so even as you were talking, and even as I read through the thesis, I was like, what would it feel like to put this in my body, or to sink down a little deeper, and to connect with it through some other sensory mode, So I know you talked a little bit about some of the media you might experience, or pulling together different creative arts therapists. So I don't want to ask you a repeat question, but I want to more so reflect some of my thought and my thinking, and how eager and excited I am. Yeah, as you develop your thoughts around how you might explore it. I don't know how, but I think there's something that can be really powerful about putting this into movement or gesture. I mean, this is what I'm doing now, because we talk about gendering organs. We talk about how our bodies move through space, so something, yes, music can be involved, but I think something that involves movement, choreography, dance, physicality, or the physicality of musicking even. Those are just some thoughts. I wonder how that lands for you.
I really love
as
that.
I riff.
No, I love the riffs. I love the riffs, and I'm here for the riffs. I want to continue to hold space for the riffs. I will say, like, I invited you, Key, particularly because of just your experience with art-based research. And I would love to just continue to hear what thoughts emerge from you. But just from what you were speaking to, No talks about different ways that racialized folks might physically habituate to racism, meaning tall folks might cower, to not be as tall, or there might be different ways of gesturing with their bodies to make them in a smaller, compact space. I find myself, so just like one example of the way I've learned to hold my body. I learned to hold my body almost like my shoulders out, and like everything just completely covering my chest, and trying to like create you know, and I habituated to that in my body. And literally 3 years after top surgery, I'm still finding myself trying to roll my shoulders back and trying to be out and be open and actually let my chest be out. And I feel like that's just one, you know, that's just one aspect that came up for me as you were talking about just bodies and reorienting. And I find a lot of times too, there is a feeling in this, it's not just about hiding the optics of a chest, but it's also, I feel like, in a way of trying to make myself smaller or not take up as much space. And so just the act of moving my shoulders out and moving my arms out, and taking up space, that seems to be a huge, important, pivotal invitation for a lot of the folks that I'm working with in gender affirming voice work. They're like, I'm afraid of speaking up. I'm afraid of being loud. I'm afraid of moving through space and taking up so much space. And so I love the idea of bringing movement in and just like incorporating boisterous movements and just out of rebellion, or, you know, going back and forth between the ways we hold our body, and how that seems to be a manifestation of habit to systems of power, not just, you know, cis heteronormativity, but also to white supremacy and ableism. A lot of the folks I work with are neurodivergent, and, you know, we're thinking about stemming, we're thinking about folks who also just the, you know, as I was writing, I was like, man, all this harping on the visual, what do blind folks feel like what do folks who don't, who access and experience sensory inputs in different ways, like what are those folks' experiences of gender, and what are their habits of gender and habits of listening, you know? So that's also just another tangent, but I really love the idea of doing movement and dance along with voicing and sounding.
Can I ask a follow-up of that too? Sorry, and then go back to you, Key. But what about this idea of using the arts to express this concept of durée? Do you think that would also work?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Honestly, yeah, the concept of durée has so much. There's so much there for, especially the way Alsace talks about like the way endured time is a rhythm. It is a grounding. It is a and just the optics of the past being a fountain that emerges into the present and continues to recreate the present. I feel like all this water imagery it can be incorporated. I think there's so much to the concept of durée that can be explored and opened up to through arts-based research. What's up, Natalia?
Yeah, can I make a quick comment? I've been trying to type it, but it looks weird. I was just wondering, just piggybacking again on what you were sharing, just like, and I think it's also coming from, how do I apply this? How do we, you know, continue to expand, like a family therapy, right? So like one of my kiddos is really talking about gender and sexuality, right? And I'm like, let's do it everywhere, like all of that, and like really honing in. But I know that this is not the case for a lot of kiddos, right? So I'm thinking about prevention, right? I'm thinking about like early life intervention, right? You know how they have like the mommy and me things, like having some sort of family therapy approach where there is a parent and a child, right? And using these multimodal like interactions, which again would fall under like a bunch of different arts and, you know, modalities, right? And to create a therapeutic space in that way, specifically when we're talking about neurodiverse as well, right?
Yes, no, I really love that. I'm actually, it's kind of like on my list to try to cultivate some kind of group for parents of trans kids who don't know how to support their kids. And I think, you know, doing some family-based stuff would be really lovely and impactful. There's also one neurodivergent kiddo I'm working with right now who is literally habituated to being seen with experiencing violence and does not want to be seen. So there's just, and does not want to be heard, like, you know, just as a default right now. And so I think there's just, there's so many ways that arts-based modalities could create a container for people to experience relationships that are affirming. And I think doing that in ways that model to parents are very important, because I think like we get too caught up in words and just over explaining. And like Oleg says, this is not a crisis of understanding. This is a crisis of empathy. And I think if we really, like he said, let this come into our bodies and let this become expressed in bodies and through bodies, instead of just through words or through superficial like ideas or thoughts, there can just be so much that emerges from that shifts what's going on.
Yeah, I'm seeing like this musical conversation between parent and child once you get to that space of like demonstrating empathy as like my natural reaction and response to my child, and having the music provided by the parent while the child is like engaging in their movement, and seeing that reflected back into like, how much do you really see me,
Yes. Oh, I love that. Especially for like very early childhood. And
that's what I mean, like early life.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking of something that one of my friends in the community, his name's Kirill, and he made a post that a lot of people will quote, but only the first half of, and he basically talks about how parents, who decide to gender their child, but they find out that their assumption was incorrect, need to have conversations with their kids. We're like, I am sorry that I saw this about you and thought this about you and put this on you. And then he concludes with saying, and we need to shift away as parents from just habitually gendering our children. And that doesn't mean not experiencing gender or not talking about gender. That means literally being open to how kids develop and emerge through space, and co-creating their life with them, and giving their creativity a platform, instead of making it something that they have to assert strong enough to challenge what the parents already assume. So I think that his philosophy in that way really resonates with what you're talking about, Natalia, with this early childhood family therapy stuff.
I don't have more, y'all. No, we had time. It's good. It's so great, the conversation. That's what it should be. So I'll say two things. One, I just want to lift up, you pointed to some healing justice frameworks and lineages, even the new book I saw in your references by Kara Page and Erica Woodland, and appreciate those links. And I'm curious to hear more, see more as you develop the project, how that framework informs your work. Sorry for the sirens. And lastly, just to wish you a friend of mine, one of my dearest friends, we use this phrase, the beautiful nextness, to talk about, you move along on a journey, and we've worked so hard, and I can't even imagine how much work you've done and the journey you've been on. So I am wishing you, the best in the beautiful nextness of what is to come for you, Rae, and this project and this work and different strands and pieces of it, however you decide to share it in the world. So thank you so much for letting me be a part of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would love to continue to develop any of this with y'all further. Like I said, like I really feel like this cannot just be something that is done by me, and I don't want it to be something that's only done by me. So I would love to just hold space for how this might, want to move through all of y'all's work.
I'd like to thank you all, and it's just been a really beautiful hour and a half, and I really appreciate you all.
I appreciate you, Sue. I appreciate you challenging me to do this. I remember being so frustrated when you're like, well, if you don't find it, you got to write it. And I'm like, but I just want to find it. I just want somebody to find it so I don't have to write it. And here I am. So I just.
Well, you've stretched me a long way. With a lot of concepts that I had to learn alongside you. So, yeah.
Thank you for holding space for that.
And I hope that this is the beginning of a lovely weekend for you all.
Yes, I do too.
I received that. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Take care, everybody.